A single gunshot echoes through the marble halls of the grand Venetian palazzo just as the midnight bells begin to chime, and every guest wears an identical golden mask. Welcome to the story that still gives me chills after all these years. Grab a cup of tea or settle into your favorite chair, because tonight we are stepping back to 1936 for one of Hercule Poirot's most twisted cases. Chapter 1: The Invitation and the Golden Masks. The envelope arrived at Poirot's London flat on a cold November morning. Thick cream paper, sealed with scarlet wax and stamped with a tiny black gondola. Inside was a single card written in elegant Italian. "You are expected at the Palazzo Contineri on the night of December 31 for the Bal des Masques d'Or. Come as you are, but leave as someone else." No signature. Only a golden mask pressed into the corner like a kiss. Poirot turned the card over in his small, neat hands and raised one eyebrow. "My friend Hastings," he said, "these Italians, they love their drama, but they seldom invite a Belgian detective unless someone is planning to die." 3 weeks later, under a moon so bright it turned the Grand Canal to silver, the little steamer carried Poirot and Hastings toward the glowing palazzo. Venice in winter is quiet, almost secret. The usual crowds have gone, and the city belongs to the cats and the ghosts. As their boat slid beneath the arched bridges, Hastings tried to joke about finally seeing Poirot in fancy dress, but the detective only stroked his famous mustache and stared at the dark water. They stepped onto the private landing, where silent servants in black livery waited. Each guest surrendered their coat and received instead a heavy golden half-mask that covered the top half of the face. The masks were identical, every single one. No eye could recognize another. Even the servants wore them. Only the mouths and chins remained free, so people could drink and speak and lie. Inside the palazzo was a fever of light. Hundreds of candles floated in glass bowls on the water that ran through the ground floor in narrow canals. Chandeliers dripped crystals like frozen tears. A small orchestra played behind a curtain of black gauze, so the musicians too stayed hidden. Men in black tailcoats and women in gowns of crimson and emerald drifted across the marble like beautiful phantoms. Champagne flowed and laughter sounded too loud, too brittle. Poirot accepted a glass, but did not drink. He moved slowly through the crowd, his small figure neat in perfect evening dress, the golden mask making his green eyes shine brighter than ever. Hastings lost him almost at once, swallowed by the mask tide. At 11:30, the host appeared on the grand staircase. Count Alessandro Contineri, tall, thin, and silver-haired, wore the same golden mask as every guest, but everyone knew him by the enormous ruby ring that flashed on his right hand. He raised both arms, and the orchestra fell silent. "My friends," he called in a voice that carried to every corner, "tonight no one is who they seem, and tomorrow no one will remember who they were. At midnight the lights will die for exactly 60 seconds. In that minute of perfect darkness you may kiss a stranger, steal a secret, or settle an old debt. After that, the new year begins clean." A ripple of nervous laughter ran through the ballroom. Poirot did not laugh.
He had noticed 3 things already. First, the Count's ruby ring trembled slightly on his finger. Second, a woman in an emerald gown stood alone near the largest canal, staring at the black water as if she wanted to jump. Third, a man in the far corner kept one gloved hand pressed inside his coat, exactly where a pistol might rest. 11:58. Guests began pairing off for the midnight darkness. Some giggled, some whispered, some looked suddenly afraid. Poirot found Hastings again near a pillar. "Keep your eyes open, my friend," he murmured. "When the lights return, someone in this room will no longer be breathing." 11:59, the orchestra struck a final wild chord. Midnight. Every candle, every lamp, every chandelier went black at the instant. The palazzo plunged into absolute night. A woman screamed once, then stopped as if a hand had covered her mouth. There came the rustle of silk, the clink of glass, the soft splash of water. Then one sharp sound. Crack! A gunshot so loud it seemed to come from inside your own skull. 60 seconds of chaos. Then the lights blazed again. The orchestra began a frantic waltz as if nothing had happened. Guests blinked and laughed and pretended the noise had been a champagne cork. But near the grand staircase, Count Alessandro Contenieri lay on his back, golden mask still perfect, the front of his white shirt now dark and wet. The ruby ring glinted one last time before his hand went slack. Hercule Poirot pushed through the crowd and knelt beside the body. He touched 2 fingers to the Count's neck, then looked up at the ring of masked faces. "Mon Dieu," he said softly, "the perfect murder in the perfect darkness. But perfection, mes amis, is exactly what Hercule Poirot understands best." The orchestra played on. The new year had begun with blood on the marble, and every single person in the room still wore the same golden mask.
Chapter 2. The 60 Seconds That Killed a Count. The orchestra never missed a beat. Violins screamed over the body as if the waltz could drown out death itself. Guests stepped carefully around the widening pool of blood, trying not to stain their shoes, while pretending they saw nothing at all. A woman in silver fainted and was carried away by 2 masked men who looked relieved to have an excuse to leave the room. Within minutes, the ballroom had rearranged itself into little knots of whispering phantoms, each group claiming they had seen nothing, because, of course, they had seen nothing. Everyone wore the same face. Poirot stood up slowly, brushing invisible dust from his knees. He looked almost amused. Hastings hurried to his side, white as the marble under their feet. "Good Lord, Poirot," he whispered, "that shot came from inches away, yet no one admits to standing near the Count when the lights died. Someone is lying." "Someone, Hastings," replied Poirot, "is always lying. The question is, how many?" He bent again over the body, this time lifting the golden mask just enough to study the dead man's eyes. The pupils were wide, black, and already fixed on whatever comes after midnight in Venice. A single bullet hole sat neatly in the center of the white shirt front. Powder burns ringed the cloth like a tiny black sun. Whoever fired had pressed the barrel directly against the Count's heart. Poirot sniffed delicately, and his mustache twitched. "English powder," he announced. "Very fine, very expensive. not the sort an Italian count keeps in his drawers. A ripple passed through the nearest guests. English powder meant an English guest, or at least an English gun. At that moment the palazzo doors boomed open and 4 uniformed carabinieri marched in, followed by a tall man in a long black overcoat who removed his mask at once. Captain Renzo Valiero, chief of the Venetian police, had arrived far too quickly for a man who was supposed to be on the mainland celebrating New Year with his family. Valiero took one look at the body and swore softly in Venetian dialect. Then he saw Poirot, and his face hardened. "Signor Poirot, I might have guessed. Every time a rich man dies in my city, the little Belgian appears like a bad omen." Poirot bowed. "Captain Valiero, your city is very generous with its corpses. I accept the compliment." Valiero ordered his men to clear the ballroom and lock every exit. No one would leave the palazzo until sunrise. The golden masks were to remain in place. Fingerprints, voices, alibis, all were useless when every face looked identical. While the police began herding guests into the long portrait gallery, Poirot slipped away unnoticed. He moved against the tide like a small determined fish until he reached the grand staircase. There he crouched and studied the exact spot where the Count had fallen. The marble was pale Carrara, veined with gray. The blood had spread in a nearly perfect circle except for one thin, clear line that cut across it like a knife through paint. Something had been dragged, or more likely someone had stepped in the blood while it was still wet and walked away before it could spread further. Poirot followed that faint red trail with his eyes. It led down 3 steps, then vanished beneath the swirling gowns of the dancers, who had already returned to the floor, as if murder were simply another Venetian tradition. He straightened and turned to Hastings. "My friend, in 60 seconds of darkness, a man was shot at point-blank range, yet no one heard the gun pressed against his chest. No one felt the heat. No one smelled the smoke until the lights returned. That is not possible unless the killer knew exactly when the darkness would come and exactly where the Count would stand," Hastings finished breathlessly. "Precisely. And only one person announced the minute of darkness to the entire room. You cannot seriously suspect the Count arranged his own murder," Hastings said. "No," replied Poirot, "but I very much suspect someone used his own theatrical trick against him." They returned to the entrance hall where Captain Valiero was taking statements from the first row of masked guests. Each voice sounded strangely muffled behind gold. A woman claimed she had been kissing a stranger near the champagne fountain. A man insisted he had spent the minute alone, admiring a Titian painting. No one admitted to being within 10 feet of the staircase. Poirot listened for a while, then asked permission to examine the Count's private study on the floor above. Valiero waved him away, too busy to argue. The study was a dark red room, smelling of leather and old books. A fire had burned low in the grate. On the desk lay scattered papers and a silver revolver with mother-of-pearl grips. Poirot picked it up carefully. One bullet is missing. The barrel is still warm. He opened the cylinder and sniffed. Italian powder was cheap and coarse, nothing like the fine English grains that had killed the Count downstairs. "So, the murder weapon is not the Count's own gun," he murmured. "Someone brought death with them tonight, wrapped in an evening dress." Behind him, the door opened silently. A woman in the emerald gown he had noticed earlier stepped inside and closed the door. She removed her mask, revealing a pale, beautiful face framed by black hair. Tears had carved channels through the white powder on her cheeks.
"You are Hercule Poirot," she said, in perfect English. "They told me you never fail. I need you to fail this once." Poirot turned slowly. "Madame?" "My name is Lucia Contarini. The dead man was my husband. If you discover who killed him, you will destroy what little is left of my family. I beg you, look the other way." Poirot studied her for a long moment. "Madame, the dead cannot be bribed, and the living rarely deserve mercy. But tell me, why should I protect a murderer?" "Because the murderer is my son," she whispered, "and he is only 17. The fire crackled. Somewhere far below, the orchestra began playing again, a slow, sad tango that drifted up through the palace like smoke. Poirot placed the silver revolver back on the desk exactly as he had found it. 17 years old, he repeated softly, and already he knows how to kill in perfect darkness.
Chapter 3. The Boy Who Was Not There. Poirot closed the study door behind them and turned the heavy iron key. The click sounded final, like a coffin lid. Lucia Contarini leaned against the wall as though her bones had turned to water. In the low firelight, her emerald gown looked black with blood, though none touched the silk. 17 years old, Madame Poirot repeated, a child still, and yet children have been killed since Cain. Tell me everything, and quickly, because Captain Valiero is not a patient man. Lucia pressed both hands to her mouth, then let them fall. My son Matteo is not a guest tonight. He was forbidden to come. Alessandro discovered love letters from a girl who is not suitable. The Count beat him 2 nights ago, and beat him until the boy could not walk. Matteo swore he would see the new year without his father. I thought it was only anger. I locked him in his room at the top of the palace. But when the lights came back after the shot, I looked up toward the servants' gallery, and I saw him, golden mask too big for his face, standing exactly where the musicians sit. Then he was gone. Poirot walked to the window and pushed open the heavy shutters. Cold air rushed in, carrying the smell of the canal. Far below, the police launch bobbed against the landing, its blue light sweeping across the water like a restless ghost. You are certain it was Matteo? I would know my own child, even behind gold. And the pistol, madame, where would a 17-year-old boy find English ammunition in Venice? Lucia laughed once with a broken sound. From the English girl he loves, of course. She is the daughter of your Colonel Armstrong, who keeps a villa on the Giudecca. Matteo spent the summer there, learning to shoot on their private range. He thought it made him a man. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Armstrong. The name rang a small bell in his memory, a retired colonel with a young daughter and a famous collection of service revolvers. He turned back to Lucia. You will take me to Matteo's room now. If the boy is innocent, he has nothing to fear from Poirot. If he is guilty, he has nothing to fear from anyone, ever again. They left the study by a narrow servants' corridor that smelled of wax and damp stone. Lucia led him up 3 flights of twisting stairs, lit only by her small flashlight. At the top was a low wooden door scarred with old scratches. The lock had been broken from the inside, splinters still on the floor. Inside the room was chaos. Sheets twisted on the bed, a chair overturned. On the wall, someone had slashed a portrait of Count Alessandro so many times the canvas hung in ribbons. A schoolboy's Latin books lay scattered like dead birds. Poirot moved across the room in silence. He knelt and touched something small and dark on the rug. A single drop of candle wax, still soft. He lifted it to his nose and smelled the same expensive beeswax used in the ballroom chandeliers. Someone was here very recently, he said, and they carried a candle from downstairs. Lucia began to shake. Then she pointed to the open window. Look!
A silk rope made from knotted bedsheets dangled into the night, swaying gently above the black water 4 stories below. Anyone light and desperate could have climbed down to the small balcony on the floor beneath, then walked straight into the masked crowd. Poirot leaned out. The rope ended just above a narrow ledge that ran all the way around the palace. A boy could dance along it like a cat. He pulled his head back in. "Your son is clever, madame, clever enough to kill and return to this room before the police even arrived, or clever enough to make us believe he did." At that moment, a scream rose from the courtyard far below, sharp and terrible. They both ran to the window. In the blue sweep of the police launch light, a body floated face down among the gondolas. Small, dark hair drifting like seaweed, the golden mask still tied tight, though one ribbon had torn loose and fluttered in the water. Lucia made a sound that was not human and would have fallen if Poirot had not caught her. "Matteo," she choked, "they have killed my baby." Poirot stared down at the small floating shape. Something was wrong. The body wore no evening jacket, only a white shirt and black trousers, like the servants, and the mask was tied wrong, to the knot at the side instead of the back. "No, madame," he said quietly, "that is not your child. That is someone who wished very much to be mistaken for him." He turned and ran. Down the servant stairs, 2 at a time, Lucia stumbles after him. They burst into the courtyard, where Captain Valiero stood with his men around the recovered body. The dead boy had been hauled onto the wet stones. 17, perhaps 18, thin wrists, a knife wound under the ribs, not a bullet. The golden mask had been removed, revealing a face no one in the palazzo recognized. Valiero looked up, furious. "Who is this child?" Poirot knelt and gently closed the boy's staring eyes. "This, Captain, is the perfect scapegoat. Someone dressed him in spare servant clothes, tied on a mask, and threw him into the canal the moment the real killer was safe. By sunrise, all Venice would believe the Count's bastard son killed him, then took his own life in shame. Case closed, masks returned, reputation saved." Lucia fell to her knees beside the unknown boy and began to sob. Poirot stood. "The net tightens, my friend. Someone in this palace tonight is willing to murder children to protect their secret. That is useful information." He looked up at the hundreds of dark windows glowing behind golden masks. Very useful indeed.
Chapter 4. The Gallery of Liars. Dawn was still hours away, but the great portrait gallery on the 2nd floor had become a golden cage. Every guest sat trapped between old Contarini ancestors whose painted eyes stared down in permanent disapproval. The masks stayed on by order of Captain Valiero. Voices sounded hollow. Champagne had turned sour in the glasses. Someone near the fireplace was quietly sick into a Ming vase. Poirot walked the length of the gallery slowly, like a general inspecting nervous troops. Hastings trailed behind, carrying a small leather notebook and trying to look useful. Valiero had divided the guests into 4 groups: family, Venetian nobility, foreign visitors, and the English party led by Colonel Armstrong and his daughter Evelyn. Each group sat as far from the others as the long room allowed. Poirot stopped first in front of the family. Lucia Contarini sat between her elderly mother-in-law and the Count's younger sister Bianca. Lucia's face was gray beneath the mask. Bianca kept twisting a diamond bracelet until the skin on her wrist bled. Poirot spoke softly so only they heard. "One of you knows where Matteo is hiding. Speak now and the boy lives. Stay silent and the next body in the canal will be real." Bianca gave a small hysterical laugh. "My nephew is a monster. If he killed Alessandro, then good riddance to both of them. Lucia slapped her sister-in-law so hard the crack echoed off the frescoed ceiling. 2 carabinieri moved forward, but Poirot raised one finger, and they stopped. He moved on. The Venetian nobility were easier. Old men and their jealous wives who had hated Alessandro for years. None of them had the courage for murder, only the desire. Poirot dismissed them with a glance. The foreign visitors were mostly diplomats drunk on free champagne and terrified of scandal. They babbled useless alibis in 4 languages. At last, Poirot reached the English corner. Colonel Armstrong stood very straight, his military mustache bristling above the golden mask. Beside him, his daughter Evelyn, 19 and golden-haired, wore a gown of pale rose that made her look like a flower dropped among thorns. She was the only guest who had removed her mask without permission. Her eyes were red but dry. Poirot bowed. "Colonel, you bring a breath of empire to this damp palace. May I ask where you were when the lights returned?" Armstrong's voice was parade ground loud. "Beside my daughter near the orchestra, we never moved." Evelyn spoke for the first time, soft and clear. "That is not true, Papa. You left me for almost the entire minute of darkness. You said you needed air." The colonel went the color of raw liver. "Nonsense, girl. Shock has confused you." Poirot's eyes glittered. "Mademoiselle, perhaps you will walk with me." He offered his arm. Evelyn took it without looking at her father. They moved a few steps away. "You loved Matteo Contarini," he said quietly. She did not deny it. "I still do. He is gentle and funny, and nothing like his father. Tonight he sent me a note to meet him on the small balcony above the canal at midnight. I waited, but he never came. Then the lights went out, and I heard the shot." Poirot stopped beneath a portrait of a long-dead Contarini Doge. "And your father knew about these letters?" "He found them yesterday. He was furious. Said he would horsewhip Matteo, then send me back to England on the next boat. He always keeps a Webley revolver in his coat pocket. Says a gentleman is never unarmed in Europe." Poirot glanced back at the colonel, who was watching them with the eyes of a man who knows the rope is already around his neck. "One more thing, mademoiselle. The English powder that killed the Count. Could your father have supplied it?" Evelyn laughed bitterly. "Papa has crates of the stuff. He calls it the smell of empire." At that moment, Hastings appeared breathless. "Poirot, I found something in the room where they store extra masks." He opened his hand. A small golden mask lay inside, much smaller than the others, clearly made for a boy. Fresh blood spotted the inside where it had pressed against a cut forehead. Poirot took the mask and turned it over. On the inner rim, someone had scratched 2 words with a knife point. "Perdonami, Mama." "Forgive me, Mama." Evelyn gasped. "That is Matteo's writing. I have seen it 100 times. Poirot closed his fist around the mask. "Then your young Romeo is still inside the palace, wounded perhaps, frightened, certainly alive, and someone wants us to believe he is already dead." He spun on his heel and marched straight to Captain Valiero, who was drinking coffee from a silver thermos and looking like a man who hasn't slept since Carnevale. "Captain," he said, "we have been looking for ghosts when the living boy is under our noses. Order every room searched again, especially the attics and the old nursery on the top floor. Matteo Contarini is hurt and hiding, and someone in this gallery knows exactly where." Valiero opened his mouth to argue, but saw the small bloody mask and swore colorfully and began shouting orders in Venetian. As the carabinieri scattered, Poirot felt a sudden sharp tug on his sleeve. He looked down. A tiny masked page boy, no more than 10, stood there holding out a folded paper. "For you, signore," whispered the child, then vanished between the legs of the crowd. Poirot unfolded the note. A single line in the same boyish writing. "Meet me in the chapel, where the next death is yours. M." He showed it to Hastings. "Our young friend grows bold." "Or someone growing clever," answered Hastings, glancing at the English colonel who had moved closer to the fireplace and was watching the doors like a cornered wolf. The chapel lay at the far end of the palace, past corridors no guests had seen. Poirot slipped away unnoticed, pulling Hastings with him. Behind them, in the gallery, the search began, doors crashing open, footsteps pounding on marble. Somewhere high above, a wounded boy waited beneath the painted angels and the smell of cold incense. And somewhere else, the real killer smiled behind gold, knowing the net was finally tightening around the wrong throat.
Chapter 5. The Chapel of Dead Angels. The chapel door was small and half hidden behind a faded tapestry of Saint Mark taming the lion. Poirot pushed it open with one finger, and the hinges cried like a living thing. Inside, the air was thick with centuries of incense and candle smoke. Moonlight fell through a cracked rose window, painting the floor in blood red and corpse blue shards. Rows of marble angels lined the walls. Their wings had been broken long ago by Napoleon's soldiers who used the chapel as a stable. Now the angels knelt blind and weeping. In the center of the nave stood a single chair. On it sat a boy. Matteo Contarini had tied a strip of white shirt around his forehead to stop the bleeding. The golden mask hung loose around his neck, like a noose he had not yet decided to tighten. In his shaking right hand he held a small pistol, English make, still warm. "Do not come closer," the boy said. His voice cracked between child and man. Poirot stopped 10 feet away. Hastings hovered behind him, ready to throw himself in front of any bullet meant for his friend. "Matteo, you are hurt," said Poirot gently. "Let me help you." "You cannot help me. I killed him. I killed my father." The confession hung in the cold air, louder than any gunshot. Poirot took one careful step forward. "You are certain of this?" "I waited on the staircase. When the lights died, I walked straight to him. I put the gun here," he touched his own heart, "and I pulled the trigger. Then I ran. I am a monster, just like he always said." Tears ran down the boy's face, cutting clean paths through soot and dried blood. Poirot took another step. "And yet, mon petit, you are bleeding from the forehead, a wound you could not give yourself while wearing the mask. Someone struck you very hard tonight, someone who wanted you unconscious and silent." Matteo blinked. I woke up in the attic. My head hurts. There was blood on the mask. I thought I had fallen." "You did not fall," replied Poirot. "You were carried, like a puppet with its strings cut." He was now only 5 feet from the boy. "Give me the gun, Matteo. You have been brave enough for one lifetime." The boy looked at the pistol as if seeing it for the first time. Then his arm dropped, and the weapon clattered on the ancient tiles. Poirot knelt and picked it up. Empty. All 6 chambers. Not a single bullet fired. He turned to Hastings. "Our young friend has confessed to a murder committed with a gun that has not been used tonight. Curious, no?" Matteo stared at his empty hand. "But I remember the bang. I remember the smell." "You remember what someone wanted you to remember," said her new voice from the shadows. They all turned. Colonel Armstrong stepped from behind a broken confessional box. He no longer wore his golden mask. In his hand, he held an identical English pistol. "This one is still smoking." "You drugged the boy," Poirot said calmly. "A little chloroform on a handkerchief, perhaps, while the lights were out. Then you pressed your own gun to the Count's heart and fired. After that, you struck Matteo unconscious and carried him upstairs. You left the empty revolver in his hand, so that when he awoke, he would believe himself the killer. A perfect crime, spoiled only with the fact that you are an impatient man, Colonel. You could not wait for the boy to hang himself with guilt." Armstrong smiled without warmth. "Clever little Belgian, but you forget one thing. Every guest saw me standing beside my daughter when the lights came back. 20 witnesses." "No," replied Poirot. "They saw a man in evening dress and a golden mask standing beside Evelyn. They assumed it was you. But you had already changed places with a servant who is exactly your height and wears a moustache you paid to imitate your own. The same servant is now floating dead in the canal. You killed him, too, to keep your secret." Armstrong raised the pistol. "I salute your brain, Poirot, but Venice is deep and the night is long." He never finished the sentence. From the darkness above came the softest whistle of silk. A figure in emerald dropped from the broken gallery like a green comet. Lucia Contrarini landed on the colonel's shoulders, driving him to his knees. The pistol flew from his hand and spun across the tiles. Lucia clawed at his face, screaming in Italian too fast for tears. "You took my husband, you tried to take my son. I will send you to hell with both of them." Poirot pulled her away, gently but firmly. "Madame, enough. Justice is not yours tonight." Carabiniere boots thundered in the corridor. Captain Valiero burst in with 6 men and took in the scene with one sweeping glance. He almost looked disappointed that Poirot had solved everything before breakfast. Armstrong was dragged away, still shouting that a British officer could not be arrested in a foreign country. Valiero assured him the cells beneath the Doge Palace had held many Englishmen before, and none had complained about the view. Lucia knelt beside her son, cradling his bleeding head against her breast. Matteo was unconscious again, this time from exhaustion and relief. Poirot stood beneath the broken angels, and for once said nothing at all. Outside the chapel window, the first pale line of dawn touched the canal. turning the water from black to rose. Somewhere, a church bell began to ring for the new year that had almost never come.
Chapter 6. The Mirror That Lied. The great chandelier in the ballroom had been relit, and every candle burned again as if the palace itself refused to admit that death had visited. Captain Valiero allowed the guests to remove their golden masks at last. Faces looked older by 10 years. No one smiled. The orchestra had fled hours ago, taking their instruments like guilty secrets. Colonel Armstrong sat handcuffed to a marble pillar between two silent carabinieri. His military bearing had collapsed into something small and gray. Evelyn stood as far from her father as the room allowed, staring at him as though he were a stranger wearing her father's skin. Poirot walked once around the ballroom, then stopped in the exact center where the indoor canal ran beneath a little bridge of white stone. He raised one hand, and the room fell quiet. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, "we have arrested a man who fired a gun tonight. We have saved a boy who believed he fired that gun. And yet Hercule Poirot is not satisfied. Because the little gray cells, they whisper that we have caught only the hand and not the mind behind the murder." A low murmur rippled through the guests. Valiero frowned but did not interrupt. Poirot continued, "Consider the perfection of this crime. 60 seconds of planned darkness, identical masks, a host who announces the exact moment the lights will die, a bullet of English powder in an Italian heart, a scapegoat boy drugged and framed. All beautiful, all flawless, and all impossible for one angry Englishman to arrange alone." He turned slowly, letting his gaze rest on every face. Someone in this room gave Colonel Armstrong the idea. Someone told him exactly where the Count would stand at midnight. Someone made certain the lights would fail at the perfect second. Someone provided the servant who would wear the colonel's mask and take his place beside Evelyn. Someone killed that servant afterwards so he could never speak. Someone did all this long before the colonel ever stepped foot in Venice. He paused beneath the chandelier so the crystals threw tiny rainbows across his evening clothes. That someone is still free, and that someone is watching us now. A woman near the back began to weep. No one moved to comfort her. Poirot raised his voice. "Captain Valiero, you will oblige me by bringing forward the palace electrician, the man who cut the lights at midnight Valiero barked an order. Minutes later, 2 policemen dragged in a thin, terrified man in a workman's blue coat. His hands were black with grease, and his eyes darted like trapped flies. Poirot spoke gently. "Ignora, you received a note last week, yes? A note with 50,000 lire, telling you to throw the master switch at exactly midnight for 60 seconds. You thought it was one of the Count's famous jokes. You did not know a man would die." The electrician fell to his knees, babbling. "I swear, I thought the generator simply needed testing. The money was in an envelope under my door. No name. I have children." Poirot waved him silent. "The envelope, please." One of the carabinieri produced it. Thick cream paper sealed with scarlet wax. A tiny black gondola stamped in the corner, identical to the invitation Poirot himself had received in London. Poirot held it up for the room to see. The same paper, the same seal, the same hand that invited me here also paid for the darkness. Someone wanted Hercule Poirot to watch the perfect murder and admire its beauty. He turned the envelope over and smiled for the first time all night. But perfection is fragile, and this envelope carries one tiny mistake. He slipped a fingernail beneath the seal and drew out not money, but a single sheet folded many times. On it was written in elegant Italian, "Everything is prepared. The Belgian will see what we wish him to see. When the lights return, the Count will be dead, and the boy will take the blame. After that, the fortune is ours. Burn this." It was signed with a small, perfect drawing of a black gondola. Gasps echoed off the marble. Lucia Contarini rose slowly, her face white as salt. "That is my husband's private writing paper," she whispered. "Only family may enter his study. Only the family could use that seal." Poirot bowed to her. "Exactly, madame. The mind behind the murder wears the Contarini crest." Every head turned toward the family corner. Bianca Contarini, the Count's younger sister, stood frozen, a champagne glass trembling in her hand. Diamonds flashed at her throat like tiny knives. Poirot walked slowly toward her. "Signora Bianca, you hated your brother, yes. He controlled the money, the houses, the paintings, everything that should have been yours when your father died. He laughed at your lovers, mocked your debts, and threatened to lock you in a convent like your aunt in 1890. You wanted him dead for years." Bianca tried to laugh. "You are an insane little man." Poirot continued as if she had not spoken. "So you planned the perfect revenge. You invited the famous detective to watch. You chose the masked ball so no one would ever know who fired the shot. You found an Englishman with a grunge and a pistol, and you fed him the idea drop by drop until he believed it was his own. You paid the electrician. You killed the servant. You drugged your own nephew and left him with an empty gun so the world would believe a 17-year-old boy destroyed himself and his father in one mad moment." He stopped inches from her. "And you almost succeeded. Except for one detail. The envelope you used to pay the electrician still carries the scent you wear every night. L'art bleu. Very expensive. Very distinctive. I noticed it the first time you passed me in the ballroom." Bianca's glass slipped from her fingers and shattered into 1,000 bright pieces. Valiero stepped forward. "Bianca Contarini, you are under arrest for the murder of your brother Alessandro and for the murder of an innocent servant boy." Bianca looked wildly. Faces she had known since childhood stared back cold and satisfied. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came. Then, suddenly, she lunged not at Poirot, but at Lucia. Her diamond bracelet flashed as she raked it across Lucia's throat. Blood sprayed bright as rubies. Chaos exploded. Carabinieri fought to pull the women apart. Colonel Armstrong roared in fury, still chained to his pillar. Evelyn fainted into Hastings' arms. Poirot stood perfectly still in the center of the storm, watching the blood run across the same marble where the Count had died hours earlier. 2 Contarini hearts had stopped in the same night after all. Just not the way anyone expected.
Chapter 7. The Ruby That Remembered. The ballroom had become a slaughterhouse of silk and crystal. Lucia Contarini lay on her back beneath the chandelier, both hands pressed to her throat while blood pulsed between her fingers in steady crimson beats. Captain Valiero shouted for a doctor, for towels, for anything white. Servants ran in every direction like black birds startled from a corpse. Poirot knelt beside Lucia. Her emerald gown was now the color of war. The diamonds from Bianca's broken bracelet glittered in the widening pool like tiny red stars. "Hold very still, madame," he said softly. "Breathe through the nose. The wound is high. You will live to see many more midnights." Lucia's eyes found his. She tried to speak, but only blood bubbled at her lips. Poirot leaned closer. "The ruby," she managed, a wet whisper. "Alessandro's ring. Look inside." Poirot glanced at the Count's body, still untouched where it had fallen hours earlier. The great ruby ring gleamed on the dead finger, dark and heavy as a drop of poisoned wine. He crawled across the floor on hands and knees, something no one had ever seen Hercule Poirot do, and gently worked the ring free.
It came off with a soft sucking sound. Inside the gold band, hidden against the skin for decades, someone had etched 4 tiny words in Latin. In vino veritas, 1918. In wine, truth. The year the Great War ended. Poirot sat back on his heels. The little gray cells sang. He stood and faced the room. Every eye was on him now, even Bianca's, wild and triumphant even in handcuffs. "Mesdames et messieurs," he announced, "we have chased a murder across Venice and found only the second act of a play that began 17 years ago in a military hospital outside Verona." He held up the ruby ring so the light shot through it like fire. This ring belonged to an English officer who died in 1918, a Captain Edward Fairfax, shot in the back by his own commander for refusing to lead one final suicide charge. That commander took the ring as a trophy and vanished into the Italian lines with a new name, Alessandro Contarini. Gasps rippled outward. Lucia gave a low animal moan of understanding. The Count was never Italian. He was English, a coward and a thief who stole a dead man's identity and a living man's fortune when he married the real Contarini heiress 30 years ago. The woman who lay dying now gave him a son and never knew her husband had been murdered to wear her name. Poirot turned to Colonel Armstrong, still chained and forgotten in the chaos. "You recognized the ring the moment you arrived tonight, n'est-ce pas? Edward Fairfax was your best friend. You spent years searching for the man who killed him. When you saw the ruby on Alessandro's finger, you knew. And when Bianca Contarini whispered her poison in your ear, 'Kill him during the darkness, and we will make the boy take the blame,' you agreed. Not for money, for justice, old justice." Armstrong lifted his head. His eyes were steady for the first time all night. "He murdered Ted Fairfax in cold blood and laughed about it for 17 years. I only wish I had fired the shot myself." Poirot nodded once, almost with respect. "And you, Signorina Bianca," he said, turning to the handcuffed woman, "you discovered the truth in your brother's papers last year. Instead of exposing him, you decided to use it. You would let an Englishman kill an Englishman and let the Contarini name die with the impostor. After that, the fortune would be yours alone. You even invited the greatest detective in Europe to watch your triumph. A fatal vanity." Bianca spat blood at his shoes. "The fortune is still mine. Lucia dies. The boy is the bastard blood of a liar. I am the last true Contarini." Poirot smiled without humor. "No, mademoiselle, you are the last murderer, and the fortune you killed for belongs to the boy you tried to destroy." He turned to Captain Valiero. "The ring is evidence of war crimes. The Count's real name and crimes are recorded in British Army files. Matteo Contarini, born Matteo Fairfax, is the legal heir of both the English officer and the Italian mother. The courts will decide the rest, but tonight justice has already been spoken." Lucia's breathing had grown shallow. The doctor finally pushed through with bandages and brandy. Poirot stepped back to give him room. Hastings stood beside him, pale and shaking. Poirot murmured, so only Hastings heard. "You see, my friend, the perfect murder is never perfect. It always carries the scent of the first crime. In this case, the scent was a ruby and 17 years of lies."
Outside the windows, the sun rose fully over Venice, turning every canal to molten gold. The new year was only hours old, and already it had buried its dead. Lucia opened her eyes once more. She looked at her son sleeping on a makeshift bed of cloaks, at the broken angels of the palace, and at Poirot. "Thank you," she whispered, "for giving me back my son and my name." Then she slipped into unconsciousness, while the doctor worked frantically to save the life that had almost been stolen twice in one night. Poirot placed the ruby ring into Valiero's hand. "The masks are off, Captain. The ball is over."
Chapter 8. The Gondola at Dawn. The palace slept at last, a wounded animal breathing through broken windows. Doctors carried Lucia away on a stretcher toward the hospital launch. Matteo walked beside her, barefoot, wrapped in a policeman's coat, the cut on his forehead already stitched into a thin red line. He did not look back. Poirot stood alone on the water steps, watching the sky turn from rose to pearl. The canal lay quiet, except for one black gondola that drifted past the palazzo without a lantern. Its fells, the little black cabin, was closed tight. No gondolier stood at the stern. It moved as if the water itself pushed it. Poirot's breath caught. He had seen that gondola before, painted on scarlet sealing wax, scratched on a boy's golden mask, drawn in ink on a murderer's letter. He stepped down onto the landing and raised one hand. The gondola slowed, turned, and nosed gently against the marble like an obedient dog. The cabin door opened by itself. Inside sat Count Alessandro Contarini, not the dead man who lay upstairs with a bullet in his heart, but the real Alessandro, older, thinner, the face Poirot remembered from faded photographs in the British Army files. He wore the same evening dress as his impostor, but the ruby ring was missing from his finger. Instead, a narrow white scar crossed his throat, where a bayonet had almost ended the story in 1918. "You are late, Monsieur Poirot," the real Count said in perfect French. "I have waited 17 years for someone to finish what the war began." Poirot climbed into the gondola and sat opposite the ghost. "You let another man wear your name and spend your fortune while you rode tourists through the back canals for pennies." "I let a murderer live in my skin," the Count replied. "Edward Fairfax took my papers, my inheritance, my life. I took only his shame. Tonight, shame died with him. Justice is slower than the tide, but it always arrives." He reached beneath the black cushion and drew out a small leather box. Inside lay the mate to the ruby ring, smaller, made for a woman. "This belongs to Lucia," he said. "I bought it the week Matteo was born. I never had the courage to give it to her. Give it now, with my apology and my blessing." Poirot closed the box gently. "And you? What becomes of the real Alessandro Contarini?" The man smiled for the first time. "Alessandro Contarini drowned in the Piave River in 1918. Tonight, the last witness to that lie is dead. The man in this gondola is simply a boatman who must return to the poor before the city wakes and asks questions." He stood, took the long oar from its hidden rest, and pushed away from the steps with one smooth stroke. "Tell the boy his father loved him, even when he could not say it. Tell Lucia I finally kept my promise to come home." The gondola slid into the narrow Rio beside the palace. Mist rose from the water and wrapped the black boat like a shroud. In seconds, It vanished around the corner, silent as a confession. Poirot remained on the landing long after the ripple had died. He opened the leather box, slipped the second ruby onto his little finger, and looked toward the hospital launch, now disappearing under the bridge of sighs. Somewhere church bells began to ring for morning mass. Venice stirred, yawned, put on her daily mask of beauty, and pretended the night had never happened. Poirot turned back toward the palazzo where Hastings waited on the steps with 2 cups of thick Italian coffee. "My friend," said Poirot, "the case is closed. The dead have buried their dead, and the living have a future paid for in blood and rubies." Hastings handed him a cup. "And the real count?" Poirot sipped the coffee and watched a single black feather float past on the tide, perhaps from a gondolier's hat, perhaps from a raven that had watched everything. "He is exactly where he wishes to be, mon ami. Somewhere the city keeps her oldest secrets, rowing strangers through the dawn, lighter by one murder and heavier by one forgiveness." The sun climbed higher. Gulls wheeled overhead. Venice opened her doors and began another year as though no heart had ever stopped beneath her golden masks.
Chapter 9. The Little Grey Cells Speak. A small fire crackled in the palazzo's library, the only warm thing left in a house that now felt more tomb than home. Outside, Venice had slipped into her everyday costume. Fruit sellers shouting, vaponetti coughing, tourists already taking photographs of blood that had been washed from the marble hours ago. Inside, only 4 people remained. Hercule Poirot sat in a high-backed chair, legs crossed, hands folded over the head of his cane. Captain Valiero leaned against a globe, arms folded, cigarette burning forgotten between his fingers. Hastings stood by the window, pretending to study the canal, while actually watching Poirot's reflection in the glass. Matteo sat on a velvet stool, pale but steady, the ruby ring of his true father now glinting on his right hand. Lucia was still in hospital, alive, guarded by 2 policemen and one very relieved mother-in-law who had suddenly remembered how much she loved her grandson. Poirot cleared his throat, a small, polite sound that silenced even the fire. "You wish, mes amis, the complete picture? Very well. Poirot will arrange the pieces as they always were, from the first breath of the crime to the last." He began, voice calm, precise, deadly. "The crime began in 1918 beside the Piave River, when a frightened English captain named Edward Fairfax shot a wounded Italian officer in the back and stole his papers. That officer, Alessandro Contarini, survived by miracle and by silence. He watched the thief marry his fiancée, spend his fortune, and raise his son. For 17 years he watched from the shadows of Venice, rowing tourists, waiting for justice that never came. Until one woman decided to force justice with her own hands. Bianca Contarini. She discovered the truth in a locked drawer last spring. Instead of exposing the impostor, she built a perfect scaffold around him. A masked ball where no face could be trusted. Darkness that lasted exactly 60 seconds. A foreign soldier burning for revenge. A boy who could be drugged and blamed. And the final vanity, an invitation to Hercule Poirot so that the greatest detective in Europe would applaud her masterpiece. She paid the electrician. She wrote the letters that pushed Colonel Armstrong across the final line. She killed the servant who impersonated the colonel and threw him into the canal dressed as Matteo.
She struck her own nephew unconscious and left the empty revolver in his hand. Every step was perfect, except one. Bianca never understood that the real Alessandro was still alive and still watching. The night of the ball, the real Count slipped among the servants, wearing the same mask as every other soul. When the lights died, he walked straight to the man who had stolen his name, pressed a different pistol to the impostor's heart, and fired the fatal shot himself. Then he melted back into the darkness before even the colonel could act. Poirot raised one finger. You see, 2 guns were brought to the ballroom. Armstrong carried his loaded Webley, planning to kill during the darkness. The real Alessandro carried an identical Webley, also English powder, also loaded. In the 60 seconds of chaos, both men fired almost at the same time. 2 bullets entered the same heart from inches away. One killed the body, the other killed the lie. That is why the powder burns were so perfect, why no one smelled smoke until the lights returned. 2 guns, 2 killers, and 1 perfect silence. Valiero crushed his cigarette against the globe, leaving a black scar on Africa. Then Armstrong is innocent of the actual shot? Innocent of pulling the trigger, yes. Guilty of intending murder, of helping Bianca plan everything, of striking Matteo unconscious when the boy stumbled into him during the darkness. He will be deported, not hanged. And the real Count? Valiero asked. Poirot smiled, small and sad. He rode away at dawn with no name and no crimes left to answer for. Venice keeps her own better than any prison. One day, perhaps, Matteo will find a black gondola waiting at the same steps and a man who asks nothing except to be forgiven for the years he lost. That will be between father and son. Matteo looked up for the first time. His voice was steady. He left me the ring. That is enough. Poirot stood, smoothing invisible creases from his coat. And so the masks fall. Bianca will face Italian justice. Armstrong will face English shame. Lucia will live surrounded by doctors and diamonds. And Matteo Fairfax Contarini, age 17, becomes one of the richest orphans in Europe before breakfast. He walked to the door, then paused. One last detail, Captain. The invitation sent to me in London, the one with the tiny black gondola in the wax, was posted from the Palazzo postbox the day after the real Alessandro delivered fish to the kitchen. He wanted Poirot to witness the ending of his story. I am happy to have obliged. He bowed, very correctly. The case, mes amis, is closed. The little grey cells are tired, and Venice, she is beautiful only when she is allowed to forget.
Chapter 10. The Last Envelope. The vaporetto for the railway station pushed away from the Ferrovia steps just as the winter sun broke free of the clouds and set the whole lagoon on fire. Poirot and Hastings stood at the rail. 48 hours he had seen 2 murders, 3 confessions, 1 attempted murder, and a ghost in a gondola. His notebook was full, his nerves were empty. Poirot, by contrast, seemed almost cheerful. He tapped his pocket absently, the way another man might check for a wallet. "You are very quiet, mon ami," Hastings said at last. "Case closed, villains punished, boy inherits a fortune, true father rose off into legend. What more could the great Hercule Poirot want?" Poirot's green eyes twinkled. One tiny thing, perhaps, a final courtesy from the city that arranges everything, even farewells. He drew from his pocket A last envelope, thick cream paper, scarlet wax, the familiar tiny black gondola pressed into it. Hastings stared. Another one? Who on earth? Open it, Poirot invited. Hastings broke the seal. Inside was a single card and something heavier that clinked when he turned the envelope. He read aloud, voice rising with every line. To Monsieur Hercule Poirot, who saw everything and told only what was necessary. Venice thanks you for leaving her secrets in the water where they belong. The boy will never need to know there were 2 bullets, not 1. The mother will never learn her husband watched her bleed and chose to row away. Some truths are heavier than justice. Accept this small token from a man who no longer has a name and from a city that prefers beautiful lies to ugly facts. The card was unsigned, but the handwriting was the same elegant Italian that had invited Poirot to the ball. Hastings tipped the envelope. Into his palm fell a gold cufflink shaped like a tiny gondola, and beneath it a single ruby earring, the exact mate to the rings now worn by Lucia and Matteo. Poirot closed Hastings' fingers over the gifts. The real Alessandro took the second bullet with him, he said softly. He removed the ruby from the impostor's finger before anyone noticed the ring had been loosened by a man who intended to reclaim what was his. He left us the empty setting so the legend would stay clean. 1 killer, 1 bullet, 1 perfect story. Hastings looked back toward Venice, now only a low silhouette against the bright water. You knew all along there were 2 shots. I suspected when the wound was too large for 1 bullet and the heart too thoroughly destroyed for simple hatred. But some truths belong to the lagoon. They sink faster than bodies. The Vaporetto sounded its horn. Mainland ahead. Real life. Newspapers waiting to print the neat version Poirot had given Valiero. Jealous sister, vengeful colonel, tragic boy, end of story. Hastings slipped the cufflink and earring into Poirot's hand. What will you do with them? Poirot smiled, the small, private smile he saved for moments when order had been restored at the perfect price. I will send them to a certain black gondola that waits every dawn beneath the Bridge of Sighs. One day a boy will grow into a man and ask questions. On that morning, a nameless boatman will hand him these jewels and say only, "Your father was there the night you were born twice, once in blood, once in fire. He loved you enough to let you live in daylight." Poirot dropped the ruby earring into the water. It flashed once, crimson against the gold, then vanished. The cufflink he kept. For the memory, he said, of the only city that ever solved a crime before I arrived and merely asked me to sign the confession. The Vaporetto reached the open lagoon. Venice disappeared entirely, swallowed by light and distance, leaving only the taste of salt and gunpowder on the wind. Poirot turned his face toward the mainland, mustache perfect, heart strangely light. Come, Hastings, London awaits, and somewhere in Belgium a small cafe still serves the best chocolate in Europe. After Venice, even murder begins to feel simple again. Behind them, far away, a black gondola drifted beneath an arch of stone. Its passenger lifted one hand in silent salute to the little man on the departing boat, then took up the oar and rowed toward the poor quarters where no one ever asks a man's name at dawn. The masks were burned. The blood was washed away. The city put on her sweetest smile and opened her arms to the new year. And somewhere beneath the water, 2 rubies now lay side by side. One from a father who could never return, one from a detective who understood why. Venice kept her final secret perfectly. End of Chapter 10. End of The Masked Ball That Hid a Murder. Thank you for coming with me through every shadow and every lie of this story. If it kept you on the edge of your seat even once, do me one last favor. Hit like, drop your final theory or favorite moment below, and subscribe so we can step into the next impossible crime together. Your support means the world. Until the next case, my friends, keep your own masks close and never trust a city that smiles while she drowns you. See you in the comments and in the next story.